The alley reeked of stale garbage and damp concrete. It was the kind of place most people hurried through, heads down, avoiding eye contact with the overflowing bins and the occasional scuttling rat. But today, something was different. The morning sun, struggling to pierce the grimy buildings, cast a weak spotlight on a discarded, single leather glove. It lay crumpled near a dented dumpster, looking strangely out of place amidst the debris. It wasn't just any glove, it was a work glove, the kind mechanics or construction workers wore, but this one was missing its mate and looked slightly worn, as if it had seen better days. Beside the glove, nestled against a discarded pizza box, was a coffee cup lid. Just a plain, white, plastic lid. The kind you get from any corner coffee shop. Except, this lid had a small, dark smudge on it, a possible fingerprint, catching the faint sunlight. The alley itself was unremarkable, just another grimy passage behind a row of small businesses. Graffiti covered the brick walls, a chaotic mix of colors and tags. Rainwater pooled in the uneven pavement, creating murky puddles. The air hung heavy with the smell of decay and neglect. Yet, despite its ordinariness, this alley was now the starting point of something extraordinary. The glove and the lid. Two seemingly insignificant pieces of trash. But in the hands of a determined detective, they held the potential to unlock a series of unsolved mysteries. The city had been on edge, whispers of daring break-ins spreading like wildfire. 3 businesses had been targeted, each robbed of unique and valuable items. The police were stumped, with no leads and frustrated victims. Now, in this forgotten alleyway, the sun glinted off that discarded coffee lid and the worn leather of the abandoned glove. These forgotten pieces, so easily overlooked, would soon become the center of an investigation that would grip the city. The silence of the alley was broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint drip of water, a soundtrack to the unfolding drama. The story of the glove and the lid was just beginning. Detective Miller had seen it all. 20 years on the force had hardened him, etching lines of weariness around his eyes. He wasn't easily surprised, and he certainly wasn't prone to flights of fancy. But even he felt a prickle of interest as he stood at the edge of the alley, the morning sun casting long shadows around him. Miller was a man of routine. Black coffee, 5 a.m. A quick scan of the morning reports. Then, whatever case landed on his desk. Today, it was this. 3 unsolved break-ins, no witnesses, no solid leads. Just frustrated business owners and a growing sense of unease in the city. He knelt beside the discarded glove and the coffee lid, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The uniform officer who'd secured the scene stood back respectfully, letting Miller do his work. "Anything jump out at you, detective?" the officer asked, his voice low. Miller grunted, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "Just trash," he said, but his eyes betrayed his thoughts. He knew that sometimes, the smallest pieces of trash could tell the biggest stories. He was tired, yes, but he was also relentless. He'd seen too much suffering, too much injustice, to simply give up. He had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him at home, but he also had a responsibility to the city, to the people who relied on him to keep them safe. Miller carefully bagged the glove and the lid, marking each with meticulous precision. He knew the lab techs would need all the help they could get. He trusted them, but he also knew that forensic science wasn't magic. It was about careful observation, painstaking analysis, and a little bit of luck. As he stood up, brushing off his knees, he glanced back at the alley. The sun was higher now, casting a brighter light on the grimy scene. He knew, deep down, that this alley, this glove, this coffee lid, were more than just trash. They were a puzzle, a challenge, and he was determined to solve it. He believed in justice, even when it seemed impossible. And right now, justice started with a discarded glove and a coffee cup lid in a forgotten alleyway. The 3 break-ins had baffled everyone. They were different enough to suggest no connection, yet similar enough to make Miller suspicious. The first was at Sweet Surrender, a small bakery known for its delicate pastries and even more delicate owner, Mrs. Higgins. Someone had broken in late one night, not taking the cash register, but instead making off with a rare, antique music box that Mrs. Higgins kept on a shelf behind the counter. It was a family heirloom, priceless to her. The second hit was at Pages and Prose, a beloved bookstore run by a quirky old man named Mr. Abernathy. The thief hadn't stolen money either. Instead, they'd taken a first-edition copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a book Mr. Abernathy had been safeguarding for decades. He was heartbroken, more upset about the loss of the book than any monetary value. The third crime scene was Gems and Jewels, a small jewelry shop owned by a nervous young woman named Sarah Chen. This time, the burglar hadn't bothered with the expensive diamonds or gold. They'd stolen a seemingly insignificant collection of antique silver lockets, each containing a tiny, dried flower. Sarah had inherited them from her grandmother, and they held immense sentimental value. What connected a music box, a rare book, and antique lockets? It made no sense. There was no apparent motive, no clear pattern. That's what made the case so frustrating. These weren't crimes of desperation, they seemed personal. Miller reviewed the files again, the photos of the crime scene spread out on his desk. He stared at the image of Mrs. Higgins' empty shelf, the space where the music box had sat for years. Then he looked at the photo of Mr. Abernathy, his face etched with sadness as he pointed to the empty display case. Finally, he focused on Sarah Chen, her eyes filled with tears as she described the lockets. He felt a surge of determination. These people deserved justice. He wouldn't let this case go cold. The glove and the lid might be the only chance he had. He had to find a connection, a link, something that would tie these three seemingly unrelated crimes together. The victims were counting on him. The initial reports from the forensics lab were discouraging. The partial fingerprint on the coffee lid was smudged and incomplete, making a definitive match nearly impossible. It was enough to rule out some suspects, but not enough to point to anyone specific. It was a frustrating dead end. The fibers found on the glove were equally problematic. They were common enough to be found on a variety of clothing items and surfaces. The lab technicians had run them through the city's database, comparing them to known samples from previous crime scenes and suspect profiles. Nothing. Another dead end. Miller sat in his office, staring at the lab reports. He felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over him. He knew that forensic science wasn't always glamorous. Sometimes it was just a series of disappointments, a slow and tedious process of elimination. But he couldn't afford to give up. He owed it to Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Abernathy, and Sarah Chen to keep pushing. He picked up the phone and called the forensics lab. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We're still working on it, Detective," a voice replied. "We're running some additional tests on the fibers, trying to narrow down the possibilities." Miller sighed. "Keep me posted," he said, and hung up the phone. He knew the lab techs were doing their best, but he also knew that time was running out. The longer the case went unsolved, the less likely it was that they would ever catch the culprit. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and tried to clear his head. He needed a fresh perspective, a new angle. He thought about the victims, their faces filled with sadness and loss. He couldn't let them down. He would keep digging, keep searching, until he found the connection, the clue, the piece of evidence that would break the case wide open. The fingerprint and the fibers were faint glimmers of hope, and he had to fan them into a flame. Days turned into nights, and the citywide database search yielded nothing but frustration. Every known criminal with a record of burglary was checked against the partial fingerprint. Every clothing manufacturer, every textile distributor, every possible source of the fibers was meticulously cross-referenced. The computers whirred, the algorithms churned, but the results remained stubbornly negative. The pressure mounted. The media was starting to ask questions, the public was growing anxious, and Miller's superiors were breathing down his neck. He knew he needed a break, a lucky break, but those were rare in his line of work. He spent hours poring over the case files, looking for something, anything, he might have missed. He reread the witness statements, reviewed the crime scene photos, and listened to the audio recordings of the 911 calls. He even visited each of the crime scenes again, trying to get a feel for the places, trying to imagine what the burglar might have been thinking. But nothing. The cases remained stubbornly cold, the evidence stubbornly unhelpful. The fingerprint and the fibers were like ghosts, tantalizingly close but ultimately intangible. Miller started to doubt himself. Was he missing something obvious? Was he too tired, too jaded, to see what was right in front of him? He considered asking for a transfer, handing the case over to someone else. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had made a promise to Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Abernathy, and Sarah Chin. He wouldn't abandon them. He knew that the odds were against him. He knew that many cold cases remained unsolved for years, sometimes forever. But he also knew that sometimes, all it took was one small piece of information, one lucky break, to crack the case wide open. He just had to keep searching, keep digging, keep believing. The citywide database had failed him, but he wouldn't let that be the end of the story. There had to be another way. Sarah was fresh out of college, eager to prove herself. The forensics lab was her dream job, and she threw herself into her work with an enthusiasm that both impressed and slightly annoyed some of the more seasoned technicians. She saw things differently, questioned assumptions, and wasn't afraid to try new approaches. When the case of the 3 break-ins landed on her desk, she was intrigued. She studied the lab reports, the crime scene photos, and the detective's notes. She knew that the fingerprint and the fibers had already been analyzed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to be discovered. One afternoon, while reviewing the fiber analysis report, she noticed a small notation: fibers exhibit unusual sheen under polarized light. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, but it caught Sarah's attention. She remembered reading about a new experimental technique that could identify the specific chemical composition of fibers based on their reaction to polarized light. It was a long shot, but she decided to give it a try. She approached her supervisor, Dr. Lewis, a gruff but respected veteran of the lab. "Dr. Lewis, I was wondering if I could try a new technique on the fibers from the break-in case," she said, her voice slightly hesitant. Dr. Lewis raised an eyebrow. "The fibers? We've already run every test in the book," he said. "What do you think you're going to find that we haven't already?" "I know, but I noticed this notation about the sheen under polarized light," Sarah explained. "And I read about this new technique that might be able to identify the specific chemical composition." Dr. Lewis considered her for a moment. He admired her enthusiasm, but he also knew that time was precious. "All right, Sarah," he said finally. "But don't get your hopes up. And don't spend too much time on it. We have other cases waiting." Sarah smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Lewis," she said. "I won't let you down." She knew this was her chance to make a difference, to prove herself. She wouldn't waste it. She grabbed the fiber samples and headed to the lab, her mind buzzing with possibilities. This was her chance to shine. The lab was Sarah's sanctuary. The hum of the machines, the smell of chemicals, the sterile environment, it all calmed her. She meticulously prepared the fiber samples, carefully calibrating the polarized light microscope. She knew that even the slightest error could skew the results. Hours passed. Sarah adjusted the lenses, tweaked the settings, and squinted at the glowing screen. The microscope displayed a complex pattern of colors and shapes, a unique signature for each type of fiber. She compared the patterns to a database of known materials, scrolling through hundreds of entries. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she found a match. The fibers from the glove were nearly identical to a rare, imported fabric used in a specific brand of work gloves, Titan Grip. These gloves were known for their durability and superior grip, making them popular with construction workers and mechanics. But they were also expensive and not widely available. Sarah's heart raced. This was it. This was the break they needed. She immediately printed out the results and rushed to Dr. Lewis's office. "Dr. Lewis, I think I found something," she exclaimed, her voice breathless. She showed him the printout, pointing to the matching patterns. Dr. Lewis examined the results, his expression slowly changing from skepticism to surprise. "Tighten grip gloves," he said. "Those are pretty specialized." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "They're not something you'd find just anywhere." Dr. Lewis nodded slowly. "All right, Sarah," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You did good. Very good. I'll notify Detective Miller right away." Sarah beamed. She had done it. She had found the connection, the clue that could finally break the case. The hours of hard work, the doubts, the frustrations, it was all worth it. She had proven herself, and she had helped bring justice to the victims of the break-ins. As Dr. Lewis made the call, Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The glow of the microscope seemed a little brighter now. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline as he listened to Dr. Lewis's voice on the phone. "Tighten grip gloves, you say?" he asked, his voice sharp. "That's right, Detective," Dr. Lewis replied. "Our technician, Sarah, ran a new analysis on the fibers, and she got a positive match. It's a rare fabric, imported from overseas." Miller thanked Dr. Lewis and hung up the phone. He immediately pulled up a list of retailers in the city that sold work gloves. He cross-referenced that list with the locations of the break-ins, looking for any possible connections. There were only a handful of stores that carried Tighten grip gloves, and only one of them was located within a reasonable distance of all three crime scenes: Handy Hardware, a small, family-owned store on the edge of downtown. Miller grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He arrived at Handy Hardware a few minutes later and flashed his badge to the owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Johnson. "Detective Miller, Police Department," he said. "I need to ask you some questions about these gloves." He held up a photo of the Tighten grip gloves. Mr. Johnson nodded. "Sure, Detective. What can I do for you? How often do you sell these gloves?" Miller asked. "Not too often," Mr. Johnson replied. "They're a bit pricey, but they're good quality. We usually only sell a few pairs a month." "Do you remember who bought them recently?" Miller asked. Mr. Johnson thought for a moment. "I think I sold a pair just last week," he said. "A man, maybe late 30s, average build, nothing special about him. Paid cash." "Do you remember his name?" Miller pressed. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "No, Detective, I'm sorry. I don't." Miller sighed. It was a long shot, but he had to try. "Do you have any security footage?" he asked. Mr. Johnson nodded. "Yeah, we have cameras. Let me pull up the footage from last week." They went to the back of the store, and Mr. Johnson rewound the security footage. After a few minutes, Miller saw him, a man matching Mr. Johnson's description, buying a pair of Tighten grip gloves. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but Miller could see enough. He had a feeling he was looking at the burglar. The hunt was on. Arthur was, to all appearances, an unremarkable man. He blended into the crowd, a face easily forgotten. He worked a dead-end job as a clerk at a used bookstore, barely making enough to cover his rent and groceries. He was quiet and unassuming, avoiding eye contact and speaking in a low, almost apologetic tone. He had a routine. Wake up, grab a coffee at the corner shop, walk to work, spend the day shelving books and dealing with the occasional customer, grab another coffee on the way home, eat a microwave dinner, and watch television until he fell asleep. He was a ghost in his own life, unnoticed and unfulfilled. But beneath the surface, Arthur was harboring a secret, a growing desperation that threatened to consume him. He was deeply in debt, struggling to pay off a series of bad investments and gambling losses. He had borrowed money from friends, family, and even loan sharks, and the pressure was mounting. He frequented Coffee Corner, the same shop that used the plain, white, plastic lids found in the alley. He was a regular, always ordering the same thing, a large black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He always sat at the same table, near the window, watching the world go by. He was a creature of habit, finding comfort in the familiar. Miller ran the security footage from Handy Hardware through facial recognition software, but the results were inconclusive. The man in the video wasn't in the system. He then showed the still image from the footage to officers patrolling the area around Handy Hardware and Coffee Corner, hoping someone would recognize him. It was Officer Davis, a young patrolman with a sharp eye, who finally made the connection. "I think I've seen that guy before, Detective," he said. "He's a regular at Coffee Corner. Always sits by the window." Miller felt a jolt of excitement. He had a name, a face, a place to start. He pulled up Arthur's file, his address, his employment history. He learned about his debts, his gambling losses, his quiet, unremarkable life. He knew that Arthur was his prime suspect. Now, he just needed to find the proof. He needed to connect Arthur to the break-ins, to the glove, to the coffee lid. The pieces were starting to come together. The circumstantial evidence against Arthur was mounting. He lived within walking distance of all three break-in locations. He frequented Coffee Corner, which used the same lids found in the alley. He had recently purchased the Titan Grip gloves. And he was deeply in debt, with a clear motive for needing money. Miller obtained a warrant to search Arthur's apartment. He assembled a team of officers and planned the raid for the following morning. He wanted to catch Arthur by surprise, before he had a chance to destroy any evidence. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Miller and his team arrived at Arthur's apartment building. They quietly surrounded the building, making sure there were no escape routes. Miller knocked on Arthur's door, his hand resting on his gun. Arthur opened the door, his eyes wide with surprise. He was wearing a bathrobe and looked disheveled. "Detective Miller," he stammered. "What's going on?" "Arthur, we have a warrant to search your apartment," Miller said, his voice firm. "Step aside." Arthur hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly stepped back. Miller and his team entered the apartment, their eyes scanning the room. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of books and newspapers. It smelled of stale coffee and dust. As the officers began their search, Arthur stood nervously in the corner, watching them with a mixture of fear and resignation. He knew that the game was up. He knew that his quiet, unremarkable life was about to come crashing down around him. The stolen music box, the rare book, and the antique lockets were all hidden in his apartment. He had foolishly thought he could get away with it. But he was wrong. He had underestimated Detective Miller, and he had underestimated the power of forensic science. The discarded glove and the coffee cup lid had led them straight to his door. His secret was out. The search of Arthur's apartment didn't take long. The stolen items were carefully hidden, but not well enough to escape the trained eyes of the officers. The antique music box was tucked away in a closet, wrapped in a faded blanket. The first edition copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was concealed behind a stack of books on a shelf. And the antique silver lockets were buried in a box of old photographs. As each item was discovered, Arthur's face grew paler and paler. He knew that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling around him. He knew that he could no longer deny the truth. Miller watched him closely, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. He couldn't understand why Arthur had done it. Why had he targeted those specific items? Why had he chosen to break into those particular businesses? He approached Arthur, his voice low and steady. "Arthur, I know you did it," he said. "I know you broke into the bakery, the bookstore, and the jewelry shop. I know you stole the music box, the book, and the lockets." Arthur remained silent, his head bowed. He refused to meet Miller's gaze. "Why, Arthur?" Miller pressed. Why did you do it? Arthur finally looked up, his eyes filled with tears. I needed the money, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was desperate. Miller sighed. It was always the same story. Money, desperation, greed. He had heard it all before. But why those items, Arthur? He asked. Why the music box, the book, the lockets? They weren't worth that much money. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a rush. They reminded me of my childhood, he said. They reminded me of a time when I was happy. When I didn't have any debts, any worries. Miller stared at him, his expression unreadable. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Arthur hadn't stolen the items for money. He had stolen them for sentimental reasons. He had stolen them to recapture a lost part of himself. It was a twisted, pathetic motive, but it was a motive nonetheless. The search of Arthur's apartment was over, and now the questioning would begin. Back at the police station, Miller sat across from Arthur in a small, sterile interrogation room. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light a single fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. The air was thick with tension. Miller placed the evidence photos on the table between them, the music box, the book, the lockets, the tighten grip glove, and the coffee lid. Arthur stared at the photos, his face pale and drawn. He avoided eye contact with Miller, fidgeting in his chair. Arthur, we know you were at the crime scenes, Miller said, his voice calm but firm. We have the glove, we have the coffee lid, we have the stolen items. We know you're responsible for the break-ins. Arthur shook his head, his voice trembling. I didn't do it, he said. I don't know anything about those things. Miller raised an eyebrow. Come on, Arthur, he said. Don't insult my intelligence. We found the stolen items in your apartment. We have security footage of you buying the gloves. We know you're lying. Arthur continued to deny his involvement, but his voice grew weaker with each denial. He stammered, he hesitated, he contradicted himself. It was clear that he was struggling to maintain his composure. Miller leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Arthur's. Arthur, I know you're not a bad person, he said. I know you made a mistake. But you can make things right. Tell me the truth. Tell me why you did it. Arthur looked at Miller, his eyes filled with despair. He knew that he was trapped. He knew that there was no way out. He took a deep breath and finally confessed. He told Miller about his debts, his gambling losses, his desperation. He told him about his sentimental attachment to the stolen items. He told him everything. The carefully constructed facade that he had maintained for so long finally crumbled, revealing the broken, vulnerable man beneath. Miller listened patiently, his expression unchanging. He had heard it all before, but he never lost sight of the human element. He knew that even the most hardened criminals were still human beings, with their own stories, their own struggles, their own reasons for doing what they did. Arthur's confession was complete. The case was closed. Now, it was up to the courts to decide his fate. Arthur's confession was detailed and remorseful. He explained how he had carefully planned each break-in, studying the businesses, learning their routines, and identifying the items he wanted to steal. He admitted that he hadn't intended to hurt anyone, that he had only wanted to possess the objects that reminded him of happier times. He also explained why he had discarded the glove and the coffee lid in the alley. He said that he had been nervous after the last break-in and had panicked, throwing the glove away without thinking. The coffee lid had simply fallen out of his pocket as he ran away. He never imagined that those two insignificant items would lead to his capture. With Arthur's confession in hand, Miller contacted Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Abernathy, and Sarah Chin. He told them that the case was solved, that the stolen items had been recovered, and that the person responsible was in custody. Mrs. Higgins wept with relief when she received her antique music box. Mr. Abernathy was overjoyed to have his first edition copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes returned. And Sarah Chen was deeply grateful to have her grandmother's antique silver lockets back in her possession. For Miller, it was a satisfying conclusion to a long and difficult case. He had brought justice to the victims, and he had held the perpetrator accountable for his actions. But he also felt a pang of sadness for Arthur, a man who had lost his way and had made a terrible mistake. He knew that Arthur would face serious consequences for his crimes, but he also hoped that he would find a way to rebuild his life and find happiness again. The city could breathe a collective sigh of relief. The break-ins were over, and the person responsible was behind bars. The glove and the coffee lid had done their job. They had told their story, and they had brought a criminal to justice. The return of the stolen items brought a renewed sense of hope to the community. Mrs. Higgins proudly displayed her music box in the bakery window, its delicate melody filling the air with a sense of normalcy. Mr. Abernathy carefully placed his first edition copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes back in its display case, a silent promise to protect it for years to come. And Sarah Chen wore her grandmother's antique silver lockets every day, a tangible reminder of her family's history and love. The local newspaper ran a story about the solved break-ins, praising Detective Miller's dedication and Sarah's forensic skills. The article highlighted the importance of persistence and the vital role of forensic science in solving even the most challenging crimes. Miller received a commendation from the police department for his outstanding work on the case. He was grateful for the recognition, but he knew that the real reward was seeing the relief and happiness on the faces of the victims. Sarah, too, was recognized for her contribution. She received a promotion at the forensics lab and was given the opportunity to work on more complex and challenging cases. She continued to approach her work with enthusiasm and a thirst for knowledge, always striving to improve her skills and make a difference. As for Arthur, he pleaded guilty to the charges against him and was sentenced to several years in prison. He expressed remorse for his actions and vowed to use his time behind bars to reflect on his mistakes and make amends. The alley, once a symbol of darkness and neglect, became a little brighter. The discarded glove and the coffee cup lid, once insignificant pieces of trash, became symbols of hope and justice. They served as a reminder that even the smallest things can have a big impact, and that even the most difficult cases can be solved with persistence, dedication, and a little bit of luck. The city had learned a valuable lesson: never underestimate the power of a good detective and a determined lab technician. Detective Miller stood in the alley, the same alley where it had all begun. The sun was shining brightly now, casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was clean and fresh, the smell of garbage replaced by the scent of blooming flowers. The alley no longer felt grim and foreboding. It felt like a place of hope and new beginnings. He thought about Arthur, the man who had made a terrible mistake but had ultimately taken responsibility for his actions. He hoped that Arthur would find redemption, that he would learn from his mistakes and make a better life for himself. He thought about Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Abernathy, and Sarah Chen, the victims who had suffered but had ultimately found closure and healing. He was grateful that he had been able to bring them justice. And he thought about Sarah, the young lab technician who had shown such promise and dedication. He knew that she had a bright future ahead of her, that she would continue to make a difference in the world. He smiled, a rare and genuine smile. He felt a sense of peace and satisfaction. He had done his job, and he had done it well. He had protected the innocent, and he had brought the guilty to justice. He looked down at the ground, at the spot where the glove and the coffee lid had been found. They were gone now, replaced by nothing but pavement and sunlight. But he knew that they would never be forgotten. They would always be a reminder of the power of persistence, the importance of dedication, and the vital role of forensic science in solving crimes. He turned and walked away, his head held high. He was tired, yes, but he was also proud. He was a detective, and he had made a difference. He had protected the city, and he had brought hope to the hopeless. And that, he knew, was the greatest reward of all. He walked towards the rising sun, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew there would be other crimes, other victims, other mysteries to solve. But he also knew that he was up to the task. He was Detective Miller, and he would never give up. The case of the discarded glove and the coffee cup lid was closed, but the story of Detective Miller and his unwavering commitment to justice would continue. Sarah stood in the lab, the glow of the microscope illuminating her face. She was surrounded by beakers, test tubes, and complex machinery, the tools of her trade. She felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment. She knew that she was making a difference, that she was helping to bring justice to the victims of crime. She thought about Detective Miller, the seasoned detective who had taught her the importance of persistence and dedication. She was grateful for his guidance and support. She thought about Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Abernathy, and Sarah Chen, the victims whose lives she had touched. She was honored to have played a role in their healing. And she thought about Arthur, the man who had made a terrible mistake but had ultimately taken responsibility for his actions. She hoped that he would find peace and redemption. She smiled, a bright and confident smile. She knew that she had a long and fulfilling career ahead of her. She would continue to learn, to grow, and to make a difference in the world. She would always remember the case of the discarded glove and the coffee cup lid, the case that had launched her career and had taught her the power of forensic science. She looked out the window, at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the buildings. The city was alive with activity, people going about their daily lives. She felt a sense of connection to the city, a sense of responsibility. She was a part of something bigger than herself. She was a protector, a guardian, a force for good. She turned back to her microscope, her eyes shining with determination. There were other mysteries to solve, other crimes to investigate, other victims to help. And she was ready for the challenge. She was Sarah, the forensic scientist, and she would never give up. The city was safe, thanks to the dedication of Detective Miller and the brilliance of Sarah. The discarded glove and coffee cup lid had brought a criminal to justice, proving that even the smallest things can have a big impact. The story was over, but the legacy would continue. The end.